You know when you're playing an online FPS like Call of Duty, and when you fight enemies, it feels like you need to shoot them like 3 or 4 times to take them down. But when they shoot you, you seem to go down almost instantly. It feels completely unfair, like their bullets are doing more damage or you've got less health or something. What's happening there, and how come developers don't fix it? In this video, I'm going to explain exactly what's happening and why it might actually be impossible for anybody to solve. So to start off, let's think about what's actually happening when you shoot a gun at an enemy in an online game. The first thing you do is you see that enemy. So you're seeing the frame on your screen that shows you where that enemy is, or that an enemy's entered your field of vision, or whatever it is that's made you decide to shoot. Then you've obviously got a tiny bit of reaction time, like even the best players are going to have some, but older people like me probably have a much longer one. And then you pull the trigger. When you pull the trigger on your controller actually has to process that input a little bit and send it to your console or to your PC. And that's going to have a little bit of delay built into it. It's super hard to find accurate numbers on input delay because obviously none of the controller manufacturers want to admit that theirs is slower than a competitor's. But for the PlayStation 5 controller, it seems that the input delay is 4.9 milliseconds. So that's how long it takes from when you push a button like the trigger on your controller to when the console registers that input. Then after that's happened, the console has to process what's happening. So the game engine is running, it's updating at a certain speed, it will detect that you've pulled the trigger, and then it will show your gun firing on the screen. And to make it feel good, like that happens as close to immediately as possible. Now you will see the results of that super fast. Like lots of people have monitors with an incredibly fast response time, like 1 millisecond in some cases. So there's not going to be very much delay from when your console receives the input to when it shows you firing your good, and that makes the game feel good for you. Now when we're playing online, that's where the real problems begin. So that message, that information about you firing your gun and what time you did it, as well as all of the other information about whether you were moving, which way you were looking, all of that stuff needs to be sent to the game server. So your console or PC is going to package up that information and then it's going to send it to your router on your home network. And that could be something that introduces a little bit of a delay because your router is going to process it at least a tiny bit, but it's probably very small. Then that message needs to go to your local kind of junction box. So this will probably be a box on your street somewhere where all of the incoming sort of internet traffic from all of the houses on your street is going to go there, and then it's going to be sent over to your ISP's exchange. Now for some people that could be somewhere super close, like it could be somewhere next door, it could be somewhere on the same street, or it could be somewhere literally miles away. So it's going to be running through those cables, and it's probably fiber optic cables at this point depending on where you live, but it could be copper cables, which is going to slow it down even more. If you're using Starlink or something, this is literally going into space and going to a satellite and then being beamed back down to the exchange, so it will be going a huge distance if you're trying to game on Starlink, but it will end up at your ISP's exchange. And then it's your ISP's job to try and route it from that exchange to the game server, wherever that is in the world. Now, if you're playing a game from one of the big companies that has servers everywhere, or someone that uses things like Azure, where they will have servers set up for them by Amazon or Microsoft all over the world, you'll probably have a server somewhere in your country at least, or maybe in a neighboring country. But this signal is still probably traveling hundreds of miles. Now you might be thinking, why do these distances matter? Like surely this stuff's going super fast. When you load an internet site up, it seems to load really, really quickly. Why should it matter how far it is? But information has to travel at a set speed. Ideally, it would be traveling at the speed of light down a fiber optic cable, and you'd be having a direct connection to the server in a straight line. Even that is going to introduce some sort of delay. But in reality, barely any of the cabling is going to go in a straight line, so this is going to be multiplied by many, many times as things are wrapped around tunnels and roads and going around buildings and stuff like that. And all of this pales in significance to the processing time that's going to be taken up by your console, your router, all of the equipment that your ISP uses, and the game servers themselves. All of those are going to take at least a little bit of time to process all of the information. But now your signal is at the game server. So the game server can look at when you sent that, what you did, and can register that and say, okay, this person fired their gun in this direction at this time. And then it will take in all of the information from all of the other players. So that could be, just 12 players if you're playing in a 6v6 match, or it could be hundreds of players if you're playing in something like Warzone. And then it will calculate what it thinks the game state is. It will calculate what it thinks happened, and then it will send that information back to you across that entire route that it took to get the information in the first place. It has to now do the whole thing in reverse, and then your console or PC will process what it's been given as information, and then it will render the scene for you and show you what happened. Now here comes the really tricky bit, the bit that causes all of the problems. When you pulled the trigger and your console saw you pull the trigger and showed you what was happening, it didn't actually know what the other players were doing. It had to guess. So this is where lag compensation comes in. This is something that most modern games do now. They would look super weird if they didn't. But basically, your console never actually knows what's happening in the game world when it's showing you it, because it wants you to have the fastest possible input response time. It wants you to feel like everything you're doing happens instantly. But that means it has to kind of guess what everyone else is doing because it can't know what's happening to them instantly. So that means, say if an enemy's running in one direction, for the few milliseconds it takes for it to get a signal from the server updating it on what's happening, then it will just assume that they were carrying on doing that. It will assume that they were still looking the same way that it was last time it got a connection. So your computer's always kind of guessing at what was actually happening in the game world, then it gets the information from the server and it fixes it and shows you what was really happening. And this is true for every single player. So everyone is seeing the game state a little bit ahead of what they actually have information on. They're all guessing a tiny bit. When you get packet loss, that means some of that information just is never reaching you. You're not getting the expected updates. And that's why you see people start to stutter around, or people start running in one direction or freeze and then suddenly get updated. That's because the lag compensation can't deal with gaps of more than a couple of milliseconds, so it ends up making kind of terrible guesses and it looks super weird. So that first moment when you saw an enemy and you started shooting straight away, they might have started shooting straight away, but your console doesn't know that yet. Your console won't know that they started shooting until the message gets from their controller all the way to the server, and then the server updates you. So what could have easily happened is that both of you started shooting at the same time. If you both saw each other at the same time, you both probably started shooting at the same time. But from your perspective at least, you started shooting first because you just hadn't got that information from the server that they had already started shooting. So then the server will have to make a decision once it gets both inputs. It will see that, okay, you started shooting at this time, the enemy started shooting at this time. Even though neither of you saw exactly when the enemy started shooting, the server at least has kind of timestamps on the packages of information and can say, oh, well, the enemy actually started shooting first. So when you thought you were shooting maybe your second or your third shots, maybe you were already dead. So those shots now don't count anymore. So you actually only ended up firing one shot while the enemy fired 2 or 3 shots before your shots were cancelled out. And then that means that you're dead and they're not. Now this can feel super unfair, like when you watch the kill cam, because the kill cam is still a strange version of the game where it's kind of the server trying to make lots of different decisions about what actually happened, and it's not entirely the inputs that the players put in, because again, the client version of what they saw is always going to be a little bit different from the server side version. That means that sometimes you can see things that don't seem to quite make sense. And this is often where a lot of allegations of like cheating and bugs and stuff like that come from. It's just that spectator cams again kind of have to guess at exactly what was happening. And even if the spectator cam's showing you exactly what the server saw, that's not what any player saw at all. Even worse, some spectator cams in some games can show you what your client saw, and that means it's completely not what was really happening. It's showing you everything where you were reacting instantly and everyone else was reacting late, but then you still die, so that makes it look super weird. Now I see online sometimes people talking about server tick rate and how that could fix the problem, and you see people saying, you know, when they feel like they shot someone and then it turns out the enemy shot them first and they say, oh, it's because of the low server tick rate. And that could be kind of true if the server tick rate is exceptionally slow, but when you get to the sort of range that most games work at now, that's not really what happens. Server tick rate has a different effect. So the tick rate is measured in hertz, so that's sort of how many times it happens per second. And this is how many times the server does all of the calculations to work out what's happening in the world every second. Obviously, if you've got a more complex game, that's a much like higher server load, so the more times you want to do it per second, that's more taxing on the server hardware, so you need more expensive hardware to keep up if you want a higher server refresh rate. But it can make the game feel a little bit better, and the main way you see that is when you don't trade kills as much. If you have a game where a lot of the time you shoot an enemy and they shoot you and you both die, often that's because of a low server tick rate. If it nearly always happens that you shoot an enemy and they die, or they shoot you and you die, that probably means the tick rate's a little bit better. So it's not uncommon to see some games have server tick rates of around 30 Hz. So that means that 30 times a second the server is updating information. That means there's little gaps where the server might receive information, but before the next update, it sort of assumes everything there happened at the same time, because it's almost like the temporal resolution of the game, like the time resolution. So it's nothing to do with graphics, but it's like how many different slots are there for actions to happen. Now, if that's at 30 times a second, it's possible that two signals will come in saying that these two players shot at the exact same time as far as this is concerned. It will say they both fell into the same slot, therefore they both fired, I calculate both of the effects of it, and both of these players die. If you up that to say 60 Hz, so you now have a server running 60 times a second it's updating the game world, maybe one of those shots came first now. Maybe one of them fits into the previous slot and the second one comes into the second slot, and that means the first one counts and the second one doesn't, so one player gets the kill and the other player dies. That's a really, really good way to see how good the server tick rate is. It's just how often do you end up trading kills? So then we finally get onto solutions. How can developers fix this? I'm sure you've heard people blaming this on lazy developers or bad netcode or whatever, or saying it didn't used to happen in games they used to play, but there's no real way to fix it. When people say it didn't used to happen in games they used to play, that actually used to be true in some situations, and that was because a lot of games, including Call of Duty, didn't use dedicated servers. They used peer-to-peer hosting, and that meant one player in the match was the host. That meant their console was actually the server, which meant all of their inputs were triggered immediately. Everything they did happened immediately, whereas everyone else had to suffer from all of that latency. That meant you had host advantage, and that player would often very easily win the game, because for them it would feel like they were seeing every player a little bit before the enemies saw them, which was kind of what was happening as far as the server was concerned. The problem is also massively reduced if time to kill is longer. So if time to kill is longer, your fight's going on a little bit longer, those tiny little millisecond differences matter much, much less, and therefore you're not going to notice as much how unfair it is, because proportionally the little differences in time from how long it took them to kill you versus how long it took you to kill them is absolutely tiny. So you probably notice this a lot less in games like Halo or Apex. In terms of designing the game and netcode to get around it, the best thing they could probably do is make it so whatever you see on your screen is what the server sees, so you don't update your screen until the server has told you what actually happened. Big problem with that is that all of that latency I was talking about is now going to be between your controller and what you see in the game world, and that's going to feel absolutely terrible. If you've ever played on a display with really bad input lag before, or you've played with a really dodgy controller across a Bluetooth connection, it will feel unbelievably sluggish and basically unplayable. So that's the trade-off. Do you want the game to feel responsive and fast, or do you want to get a really accurate representation of exactly what's happening in the game world? You have to choose one. You can't have both. Now, if anyone has any other insight on this, or if I've got something wrong, like I'm not a network engineer or anything like that, please let me know in the comments. I'll be really interested. I'll pin any comments that I think are really interesting, that sort of correct things that I've got wrong here. If you liked the video and you found it interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you for the next one. Goodbye.